The fight against the Islamic State group in the Middle East does seem to be working. ISIS has already lost its home base of Mosul in Iraq, and it's now facing an international coalition offensive in its de facto Syrian capital of Raqqa. But could the collapse of the IS group on its home turf be increasing the threat of terrorism in the West? That is the subject of tonight's debate. Joining me today to talk more about this, first is Bashar El-Halabi, a political commentator for France 24's Arabic channel. Hello, Bashar. Thank you for being here with us.
Thank you.
Also with us is Dr. Abbas Kadim. You're an author and senior foreign policy fellow at Johns Hopkins. He joins us via Skype from Alexandria, Virginia. Also with us from Skype in Vermont, former U.S. diplomat Peter Galbraith. And joining us from London is Julia Rushenko. You're a research fellow at the Center for the Response to Radicalization and Terrorism in London. Thank you for joining us, all of you. Now, I want to start with a quote from the British Security Minister, Ben Wallace. Speaking a few days ago, he said, "I think the terror threat is still increasing, partly driven by the fact ISIS is collapsing in Syria, and people are either unable to get out there to fight for ISIS, and so they look to do something at home, or also because people have come back and tried to inspire people with their stories and tales of the caliphate." Well, let me start with that first point. The British Security Minister there saying that extremists are trying to carry out these attacks in Europe, basically because they were unable to join the IS group overseas. Bashar, is that right?
Well, technically, he has a point, but also we have to take into consideration the recent, if we can call it, shift in the strategy of ISIS since it started losing ground, and the whole myth of the caliphate has been really struck hard by the offensive against it. So ISIS right now needs a new branding, a new marketing strategy for it to still appeal to the people, to the followers of ISIS, of its radical thought. And it also needs to show that it still has strength and it still can take initiatives. So as the caliphate is being destroyed by the US-led coalition, they are trying to increase the attacks in Europe in order to send a message: we're still here, we still have our followers, we have sleeper cells everywhere, we can hit anywhere, anytime we want. We're not weak yet. So this is the main point of what's happening over there.
How about for the rest of our panel? Do you think that this ongoing fight against ISIS in Syria and Iraq has made it harder for wannabe jihadists to get out there to the Middle East? Peter Galbraith, how about you?
Well, yes, I clearly it's become more difficult. Turkey has, which was a very easy transit point, has cracked down on the border. Also, there isn't really a caliphate to go to anymore. It's collapsing. So people who are inclined to that kind of violence are now more likely to do it in Europe and perhaps also the United States. I think also you've had these lone wolf or small group attacks, and that's another pattern, and it's much harder to detect. But I think the question for both Europe and the United States is to whether we can keep this all in perspective. As terrific as the attacks are, the totality of the casualties are not great. I mean, they're very spectacular news stories. They're very moving. But they're in terms of total numbers of deaths, they're almost as rare as an airplane crash. So and they're very hard to defend against. You can't defend your public places in Barcelona. You can't defend your transport systems in New York or London. I mean, if somebody is going to get on the tube with a suicide vest, there's very little you can do to stop it.
Abbas Kadim, what do you feel about this? How strong is this connection, do you think, between these recent attacks we've seen in Europe and the situation in the Middle East? Dr. Kadim.
I agree with Bashar and Peter. It's just a matter of certain people who are trying to... Yes, I hear you. Do you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
Hello?
Please go ahead.
Yeah, as I said, I agree with Bashar and Peter. This is an issue of certain people who are trying to affiliate themselves with the so-called Islamic State. And it reminds us of the people who used to do certain acts in here and there in Europe, and then Al-Qaeda would claim the attacks. It's not necessarily a direct connection or organization or even funding by Al-Qaeda, but they will be more like sleeping cells and lone wolvers, as Peter just mentioned. And then the Islamic State will be happy to claim credit for them, just to capitalize on these acts. But they will be with us. And definitely people who used to aspire to go and fight in Syria or in Iraq, now that there is nowhere to go, then probably we will see an increase of their activities in their homes.
What about the British Security Minister's second point? How big a problem is what we call the returnees? For example, the French Interior Minister has said that over the past 18 months, close to 300 people have returned home to France from Iraq or from Syria. What do you think about this phenomena, Julia Rushenko? How afraid should we be of these returnee fighters?
Well, we should definitely be afraid of them, because at some point they will pose a very significant security concern. Nowadays, back to your question about the link of military intervention and radicalization, what I wanted to say is that I don't really agree with this link. First of all, because what we have nowadays in Europe is the problem of homegrown jihadism. People who are involved in terrorism plots, overwhelmingly they're second-generation migrants. Very often they're very young, impressionable people who for some reason are passionate about this ideology, the ideology of violence, the ideology of excessive brutality. And this is a problem for Europe and also for the United States. And of course, people who return, they will pose a further security concern, and we have to work on the measures to tackle this issue, whether it's criminal justice responses or other responses such as security measures, border control, deportation, and so on. So of course, these measures should now be discussed and taken into account.
So given what Julia said, do you all feel that the West is focusing too much on the military campaign without doing enough to tackle radicalization at home, Bashar?
I pretty much think so, and I don't really agree with Julia, because there's no reason to be afraid and to double down on the security measures, because the more Europe has been doubling down on security measures, the more terrorist attacks have been happening. So this is obviously not the right way to go forward. The thing is, Europe has to claim its responsibility as much as the US also has to claim a certain responsibility in order to tackle on a grassroots level the reason of jihadism and the reason for these fundamental ideas that have been spreading all over, especially in very young generations. So when we see here the attacks happening in Europe, most of the lone wolf attacks are people who were already under surveillance by security apparatuses in Europe. So we know about these people. Even the ones that are that returned here are well known. The security apparatuses in Europe have to take more measures in regards to these people, not general measures that are going to cause further clashes between probably immigrants and other people, second citizens, in Europe, in order to move forward and to decrease the level of attacks.
So does the rest of our panel agree with what Bashar said? Do more specific measures need to be put in place? And if so, what would those be? Abbas.
Of course.
I think that the measures, yes, the measures that need to be taken, well, a couple of things. One of them is that those returnees are who used to be in Syria and Iraq are terrorists. There is no question about it. So there are two dangers that they pose to their home countries. One of them is the possibility that they might engage in violence and in terrorist acts. The other is that they will radicalize others. They will come with a lot of romantic stories about where they were from, and it might be even their mission to go back to their home countries and recruit. So they will be very dangerous. I believe that the Western countries, including my country of the United States, are not doing enough in terms of prevention measures. The programs that are given normally are assigned to contractors who are there just to hunt for contracts and not necessarily know what they are doing. Our contractors who do this work for prevention programs are experts at getting contracts more than really experts in terrorism and on the things that are to be done to prevent terrorism. Most of them don't speak the language of these the subject they are trying to prevent from being radicalized. They don't know much about Islam and Islamic ideologies. They don't know much of anything, and most of the time they are the subcontract those to the others. So it's really there is a lot of room to improve on how to design these programs, how to work with the right people, rather than just to do it on basically as routine contracting business like they are doing a road or a building a school. That is very important, but I think prevention is needed. We do need a lot of measures. And definitely, it's no-brainer that we will. Our intelligence and our law enforcement has to work harder and smarter and work with the communities, because if you win the trust of the communities, you have cut a lot of your work for yourself. I don't know. Maybe Peter would agree with me on that, since we are both on this side of the ocean, and that is, I think, that's the impossible to dispense with methodology for countering terrorism. It's a sine qua non.
Peter, what do you have to say about that?
Well, first, I would agree that if you have the trust of the communities, you're going to be much more effective. I mean, you can look, for example, in Iraq, the difference between the Arab part and the Kurdish part. The Kurdish part has been largely free of terrorism, partly because the local security forces, who are far from perfect, have the trust of the community, where there's a great sense of alienation, particularly in the Sunni parts of Iraq. And I think the difference also is between Europe and the United States, where you have many more alienated immigrant communities in Europe than you do in the United States. That said, though, I think you also need to have some sense of balance about the resources. Since 9/11, the United States has spent at least $3 trillion on a couple of wars. And perhaps another couple of trillion on additional security measures, and that doesn't count the extra time that goes into, for example, waiting in airports or trying to enter government buildings, the cost to the society. And so, from that point of view, you could say that the Al Qaeda terrorists, for a very small operation, they force their enemy to spend $5 trillion. And if the response to every terrorist incident is both increased spending and things that begin to change the nature of the society, repressive measures, well, then again, for very little cost, the cost of renting a van and driving it into a tourist area in Barcelona, you can have a big victory. So I think we at the one hand, you want to have trust of the community, but on the other hand, you want to have some balance because these are things that are out there, and they're very hard to stop. In every case, you may stop 90%, but it's very hard to stop 100%.
Peter Yena speaking to us there from the United States. I want Julia to weigh in from the UK. There in the UK, the anti-terrorism program PREVENT has been running by the government for some time now. Do you think that is the right tool to keep people from being radicalized? Is that working? Can that be an example for the States?
Absolutely. When I first mentioned about security measures, I actually meant that security measures should go hand in hand with a sound and comprehensive de-radicalization program, and a program that counters radicalization, appeal of violent ideology, specifically among young people. And the UK has been quite successful with that. So the PREVENT system that was introduced in 2003, it has been actually focusing on working with the communities, first of all. So it's the local communities, it's the families, it's the teachers, it's the social circle that young people interact with. So the idea was to, through work with, for example, teachers or health practitioners or lecturers, they could possibly flag certain vulnerabilities and certain issues that people might experience. And later on, the Channel program, the so-called de-radicalization, police-led initiative, would work with those people at risk, vulnerable individuals. So in my opinion, it has been quite successful. However, there has also been human rights criticism of this particular policy, and we should also take this into account.
Thank you, Julia, for that. Bashar, do you want to weigh in on that?
Well, actually, what Abbas and Peter talked about is more detailed than what I was trying to say when I mentioned that on the grassroots level, the de-radicalization process should be tackled. I definitely meant by having more people who are experts in the domain, people who are in touch with the reality, in touch with the ground, in touch with the communities, that are able to build more and more trust within the community and within the younger generations in order to have them de-radicalized in case they are, or in order to show them another side of the story.
All right, Bashar, thanks for that. Panel, stay with us. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be back with more of the France 24 debate. Don't go away.
Revisited, presented by Stuart Norval.
Nicaragua, 1979. The Sandinista revolution overthrows the pro-American government. Their leader is Daniel Ortega. In 1985, the former guerrilla warrior is elected president on a heavily Marxist platform.
Estamos muy bien atendidos, gracias a Dios y al gobierno actual que ha restituido muchas actividades sociales, económicas, para que estamos muy bien.
Daniel Ortega was a popular commander from the beginning. 40 years later, what remains of his ideals?
La revolución era una poesía, era un amor en los años 80. Hoy lo que vemos es una dinastía familiar. Todo aquello que combatió, todo aquello que criticó, todo aquello que cuestionó, ellos lo han hecho.
Revisited on France 24 and France24.com.
I'm Sarah Morris and I'm France 24's correspondent in Madrid. I'll bring you the latest news on Spain and Portugal, two countries battling to leave behind years of austerity. Join me live and check out my reports on France 24 and France24.com.
Sarah Morris, one of the 160 France 24 correspondents around the world.
Porque la historia se escribe día a día. Porque la actualidad no espera. La información, donde quiera que esté. En cualquier circunstancia. Todos los temas. Para entender el mundo. Para imaginar el mundo. France 24. Una mirada diferente. A partir del 26 de septiembre, en español.
This is France 24, a quick look at today's headlines. Police in Spain confirm that the main Barcelona attack suspect has been shot dead. He's the man thought to have killed 15 people in Thursday's attack on the Ramblas. The US and South Korea kick off joint military drills today. Those are using computer simulations designed to prepare for war with a nuclear-capable North Korea. And millions of Americans turn out for a glimpse of the first coast-to-coast total solar eclipse in nearly a century. Welcome back to part two of the France 24 debate. Today we are looking at the fight against the Islamic State group in the Middle East and the effect that may or may not be having on terror attacks in the West. Now, we were talking before about the attacks recently, of course, in Barcelona. And I have a question for our panel, actually, about Barcelona. It does seem a bit different, if I can speak almost crudely. You might say it's relatively low on the Islamic State's hit list in a way because they're a very reluctant partner in this coalition. Spain is just providing logistical aid, training to local Iraqi forces. Why do you think, panel, Spain was targeted? Peter?
I think because the attackers were in Spain, so this was a target of opportunity. I mean, why was the attack in Brussels, which Belgium's not a huge part of the coalition? So I don't think that there's a coordinated strategy aimed at their their top enemies, but rather these are individuals or groups of individuals who see an opportunity, perhaps either in communicating through social media or simply researching how to build bombs on the internet. Or, I mean, how difficult was it for them to do what they did? They rented a van and drove it into a crowd. I mean, this is the same thing that was done in Nice. So there was an example, and it turns out to be a very deadly way to kill people. But I think they did it because they were there.
Does anyone else think Spain in particular was targeted, or do you all agree with Peter? Bashar?
I agree with Peter, because also we can ask the same question for Finland. Why Finland? Mm-hmm. So it's more about basically lone wolf attacks, people who found the opportunity, as Peter mentioned, in order to conduct these attacks, who were indoctrinated one way or another, or they even fancied the idea of doing something like that. They had certain grudges maybe, and they went on to perform these attacks with no clear. Like ISIS right now has no clear tactic in its recent wave of attacks in Europe and the Western world. As soon as something happens, they claim it because they're more than glad to get the credit for it, because it feeds into the new probably strategy of decreasing the concentration on the idea of the caliphate and expanding terror all over the world.
Mm. We're talking, of course, about an eventual link, if there is one, between the fight against the Islamic State group in Syria and Iraq and the increase we've seen here in the West in terror attacks. Last month, of course, Iraqi forces backed by the U.S. drove the Islamic State group out of Mosul after a grueling 9-month campaign. Now the Iraqi government has launched a new offensive to take back one of the last pockets of ISIS-held territory in Iraq. Alison Sargent has more now on the situation in Tal Afar.
Belgian and American special forces set up position on the roof of a house, keeping a lookout and firing mortar to back up Iraqi government troops as they move in on several villages, some 30 kilometers east of Tal Afar.
As our units started moving in, the enemy collapsed. They had several small groups of fighters and were using suicide vehicles as well as roadside bombs, which they assumed would stop our forces.
Iraqi generals say the 2,000 militants left in the city have limited supplies and are weary after months of aerial bombardment. But they're still expected to put up a tough fight, as they did in Mosul, officially retaken just over a month ago. Tal Afar is now one of only a few remaining Islamic State strongholds in Iraq. Another pocket of militants is in Kirkuk, with the rest mainly spread across the desert region around the border with Syria.
Operations to retake Nineveh will not stop until everywhere in the province is liberated, including Tal Afar, Mahalabia, Al-Ayadia, and other areas. Then the Iraqi forces will complete a border check.
Experts say that street fighting in residential areas will be the troops' biggest challenge, just like it was in Mosul. While most of Tal Afar's residents have already left, the UN warns that up to 40,000 civilians remain in the area and are expected to flee as coalition forces move in.
The big question now is Tal Afar a done deal? Abbas Kadim, do you think that Tal Afar will fall as Mosul fell?
Tal Afar will be liberated quicker than Mosul. Mosul was a larger city, more complex, many more civilians. Most of the civilians of Tal Afar have fled. The government says that all of those who are left, even the local residents, are most likely parts of the Daesh, the ISIS. So it is going to be easier. It's a smaller city and it is a quicker. The only thing that made Tal Afar wait this long is because of the regional and internal dispute over it. The Turks had a veto over who gets to liberate it. Also, there was the United States and the coalition it led was reluctant to go for Tal Afar until all of these disputes were, especially about the popular mobilization units, Al-Hashd al-Sha'bi. But the recent visit by the Iranian top officer to Turkey, it seemed that it paved the way, and the Turks now signed on the operation. Also, it is the only logical thing to do after Mosul has been completely liberated. That will leave only Hawija not liberated from the towns in the hands of ISIS. With the liberation of Tal Afar, the entire province of Mosul will be liberated, and that's a very huge symbolic victory for Iraq and against ISIS, because it meant a lot for them to establish the caliphate there. As Peter said, there is no more caliphate anywhere in that neighborhood. So yes, I think it's going to be fairly quicker than Mosul because of the topography and the demographic situation there, the number of civilians, and also now that everybody is on board on the liberation of the town and there are no vetoes anymore.
Of course, but then the big question is going to be, how do you govern these kind of regions after you take them back from the Islamic State? There are obviously big Sunni-Shia tensions there. How do you keep those from exploding? Peter, what would you say?
Well, I think this is the critical issue. I mean, it's very important to understand what happened in 2014, which is that maybe 1,000 ISIS militants in pickup trucks came into Mosul, and they defeated in 36 hours the several Iraqi army divisions, which were armed with state-of-the-art American military equipment, which they then captured and used against the Kurds. Now, what a great deal of what happened, of course, is that they were already in the city because the population was so alienated from the government. Now,
sorry, Peter, we just
it will solve the problem, but basically the tensions are much deeper than that. I mean, the Shia see the Sunnis as the enemy because the Sunnis have been the enemy, and I don't think they're really prepared to reconcile.
Again, it's a fundamental question. Are they prepared to reconcile? And if so, how would that work? Bashar?
I doubt at the moment there will be any breakthrough in the reconciliation process, because it doesn't seem so, at least on the national level. We still hear, up until now, there are reports emerging from international human rights groups and organizations that talk about crimes, hate crimes, crimes like ethnic cleansing, sectarian cleansing, and stuff like that. So I'm afraid at the moment it's a really tricky ground, because moving forward in Iraq is it's going to be very slow. The process will be very slow. And if the process of rebuilding the state and spreading its its power all over the country doesn't take into consideration the power sharing, doesn't take into consideration the different groups and sects in the country, then the problem will always be there, and we might see something similar to ISIS.
Another interesting thing as this conflict has been developing is how the Islamic State group, if you like, or the reaction to it, has almost redrawn traditional lines between enemies. I'm thinking in particular, for example, Syrian troops have captured significant ground from the Islamic State on several fronts. Could Bashar al-Assad have made that kind of progress just a few years ago? I mean, he seems to be in a much more confident position today than he was a few years ago.
Well, I don't think at the beginning of the establishment of ISIS, Bashar al-Assad was really interested in fighting ISIS. It was more about fighting the rebel groups who posed a real threat to his regime and to his mere existence. However, right now, Bashar al-Assad is banking on the rhetoric of fighting terrorism all over the country, and the global atmosphere that is actually that has dropped down the idea of Bashar al-Assad stepping down for the meantime in order to find a political solution in Syria. So it's a golden opportunity right now for Bashar al-Assad to do that. Also, we see something similar happening in Lebanon, between the borders of Lebanon and Syria. Right now, the Lebanese army has been drawn into a confrontation with ISIS by Hezbollah and by the Syrian regime. And although the Lebanese army has been very strict about the idea that no one is aiding them, except definitely there is American aid for the army, but no one is helping them on the ground. But Hezbollah and Bashar and the Syrian regime says, no, this is not the story. So Bashar al-Assad sees it as an opportunity right now in order to re-establish himself, reinvent himself. And Beirut and Lebanon is a really strategic point for him in order to spread out into the world.
Do you agree, for example, Peter Galbraith, that could this be a golden opportunity for Bashar al-Assad? Because obviously this could cause some problems for people in the West, obviously, who want him to step down.
I think the real point is that there were two wars in Syria. They were not connected, and they're both coming to an end. In the West, Assad was fighting a range of rebel groups, from Western-oriented Democrats to Islamists. They were supported by Turkey, but he has had the support not only of Russia and Iran, but of Iraqi Shia militias and Afghan Shia militias brought in from, or not just as Shia, in a case of the Afghans, brought in by Iran. And he's won that war. And in the east of Syria, there's an entirely separate war between the Kurds, the YPG, and the Islamic State. The Kurds have the American Air Force as their air force, and they have American and NATO special forces with them, and they are winning that war. And so the interesting thing is going to be what happens, when the two front lines, if you will, combine. My guess is that you will end up in Syria with something like the situation in Iraq after 1991, where there's this, where you had Saddam in control of most of the country, a Kurdish enclave, and you'll have more or less the same thing in Syria, which will have probably the continuing presence of American forces all over the opposition of Turkey. And so this is part of a broader process in which state lines are beginning to be redrawn, certainly de facto. And of course, on the 25th of September, the Kurdistan region of Iraq will have a referendum on independence, so that maybe begin to be redrawn formally.
What about the Iranian role in the fight against the Islamic State group? Could this campaign in the long term perhaps help improve the relations between Iran and the West, Abbas?
Well, actually, Iran has been instrumental in keeping Assad in power, along with the Russians, but definitely the Iranians are more on the ground, and they have invested in that. And the Iran-Syria relations, as you know, go back all the way to the 1980s, 1982, during Bashar Assad's father's time. And this alliance has witnessed so many events and changes in the Middle East. It endured the test of time, and it continued. And the Iranians see in Syria a strategic place that they will never give up. It is the only vulnerable area that can disrupt an Iranian or a smooth path from the Iranians to from Iran to the Mediterranean. Iraq and Lebanon being sort of more guaranteed from an Iranian perspective. Syria is the issue that needs more work. Assad, of course, has been helped a lot by the fact that his opponents or enemies, especially the ones who have a real shot at replacing him, are more despicable than he is. So many people who were willing to go against Assad in this fight didn't, especially I'm referring here to the Iraqi government. Assad just gave a talk in the last hours, and he embarrassed his Iraqi allies. I'm talking about the ones who are fighting, not the Iraqi government, by mentioning or thanking the Russians, the Iranians, Hezbollah, but he did not mention the Iraqis who fought in Syria since the beginning of the conflict. And now, people are trying to see why he didn't do that. Is it that he doesn't want to acknowledge them, or there is a deeper agenda? But definitely, I think back to your question, Iran and the West, most of their problems are not about Syria. It is really about the Iranian-Israeli situation, and that is very far away from being reconciled, and also the Iran-Saudi conflict. One of them, of course, is Israel sees Iran as a direct threat to its security, being the largest and strongest country in the Middle East that is clearly having stated policies against Israel, and the Saudis, of course, being Wahhabis, and the Iranian are Shia, and that conflict is more of an ethno-sectarian, on a sectarian ground, but also it is a competition between a country that is already a hegemon in the Gulf region locally or regionally, and the Saudis who aspire to be hegemons on the other side, and they don't know how.
Why do you think, going back to what Bashar was saying before, why do you think Lebanon hasn't been hit harder? And could the Islamic State group try to expand into Lebanon? It's an easy target. They do share a border. Julia, is that something you could speak to?
Whether Lebanon is
could be a target. Why it isn't targeted? Why it isn't targeted more by the Islamic State group?
That is actually a very good question, because it's quite controversial. If we look at the civilians' death by airstrikes of the countries that basically were responsible for the attacks, if we look at the civilian death by Russian airstrikes, we'll see that they are much higher than the coalition airstrikes. So actually, it's Russia that was supposed to be target, right, a few years ago. However, it wasn't happening. So sometimes it really is very logical.
Bashar.
Before mentioning Lebanon, I would like to point out that it's true that Iran has an easy path from Tehran probably to Beirut. However, the Saudis right now, with hosting Muqtada Sadr a few weeks back, and with probably trying to re-establish a foothold in Iraq, will pose a certain threat to the Iranians. However, the Iranians have been investing in Iraq since 2003, since the fall of Saddam. So it's going to take a lot of time, energy, and effort for the Saudis. It's a long-term project, and I don't know if they'll be up to it. Going back to Beirut and Lebanon, the Lebanese society in general, even the Lebanese Sunnis, have proven to be a community that has no affiliation or no appeal to fundamental or radical ideas. And very, very few number of Lebanese people went to fight in Syria in the ranks of ISIS. So there's no fertile ground for fundamental ideas in Lebanon, so that Lebanon would be hit. And another thing is that the Lebanese borders have been secured for a long time now, and the last spot for ISIS on the borders is being contested right now by the Lebanese army, and they're almost done.
We were talking before about these changing lines between enemies, if you like. One thing we might see down the line, I don't know, perhaps our American colleagues Peter and Abbas could weigh in on this, is the situation with Hezbollah. Is there any way we could see the U.S. and Hezbollah lining up against the Islamic State group?
Well, I think that's unlikely. But I think the interesting question, of course, is Hezbollah's ally Iran. And in the case of what's so striking is how many interests in common the United States and Iran have. The American invasion in 2003 got rid of the country, the number one enemy of Iran, Saddam Hussein. They lost 1 million lives fighting him unsuccessfully in the 80s. And basically led to the installation of Shiite religious parties that Iran had backed for decades. The U.S. got rid of the Taliban. They have a common interest in opposing Islamic State and al-Qaeda type radicalism, which considers Shiites to be apostates. So the poor state of relations between the two doesn't actually reflect the community of interest. By contrast, of course, Saudi Arabia is the sponsor of a lot of Islamic fundamentalism. What makes it difficult for it to extend to Hezbollah, first, it's not a state, and second is the fact that Hezbollah and Israel are sworn enemies.
Just very briefly, Abbas, if you'd just like to weigh in on that, we're almost out of time, I'm afraid. Sorry, well, we're waiting for Abbas. Bashar, go ahead.
No, I agree with Peter. Just probably one thing that I want to go back to what Bashar said, which is very important.
Yes, go ahead, Abbas. It's fine. Okay, can I say something?
I mean, what you said is very important on the Saudi bidding that they would probably court some Shia in Iraq to prevent Iranian access. I think if the Saudis have made many bad miscalculations in Yemen, Qatar, Syria, and other places, if that is their plan for Iraq from now on, I think that would be the biggest folly they are having, knowing Iranian influence in Iraq. This, Muqtada al-Sadr is not going to be a winning strategy for the Saudis. The Saudis need to work with the Iraqi government rather than bidding certain Shia against others. Again, the Saudis are not good at doing this, and I think they will fail also. But you are right, that seems to be the Saudi strategy now. It is just a failing strategy.
Bashar.
Also, one last thing about what Peter said. I think the U.S. and Iran don't have common interest among each other. I think the U.S. shortcomings and the misunderstanding of many parts of the region, which included many wars in the region that were conducted, played in the benefit of Iran. And as much as Saudi Arabia is involved in funding terrorism, I think Iran is as well.
All right, Bashar, thank you so much. I think we have a few more minutes. Oh, hang on a second. Yes, just one last question before we go. We're about to get our media watch set up. It seems to be just taking a minute longer. Julia, we've been talking so much about radicalization. What do you think for you would be the one key thing that Western nations need to do to stop this kind of phenomena like we've been seeing in recent months? Just in 2 sentences.
Definitely invest more into counter-radicalization strategy that is based, first of all, on work with the communities and to be able to stop those individuals, prevent them from being drawn into violence and terrorism. So counter-radicalization strategy, more sound, more consistent one, that is definitely I would recommend.
Julia Rushenko, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us here on The Debate. I'd like to say a big thank you to all of our panel today. Peter Galbraith speaking to us there from Vermont, Dr. Abbas Kadim speaking to us from Virginia, and Bashar Al-Halabi from France 24 here on the set. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
To all of you, this wraps up today's France 24 Debate. All right, we're going to switch gears here just for a minute for Media Watch with Shona Bhattacharya. Hi, Shona.
Hi, Jeannie.
You're going to start telling us about Donald Trump, but about how Donald Trump and his family have actually blown their security budget for the year already.
That's right. It's a USA Today exclusive. It's a story that's getting picked up by a number of U.S. and Anglophone news outlets. Now, the USA Today journalist interviewed Secret Service Director Randolph Tex Alice, who says that more than 1,100 agents have hit the federally mandated caps for salary and overtime allowances that were meant to last the entire year. That's about 1/3, more, in fact, than 1/3 of the Secret Service workforce. Now they need Congress to intervene to provide additional funding to pay for those agents, for those that work that they've already done. Now, this, just a reminder, is coming ahead of next month's UN General Assembly, when about 150 international leaders will also be needing a Secret Service detail. Now, under Trump, 42 people have protection. 18 of them are family members. Under Obama, let's compare, that was 31 people, 31 to 42. Now, almost every weekend, complicating the facts. So there are several things, right? On one hand, Trump has his big family, has a lot of people to protect. On another hand, he's very, very mobile. Almost every weekend that he's been in office, he's gone somewhere, either to his property in Florida, in New Jersey, or Virginia. He's gone 7 times to Mar-a-Lago in Florida. That's about $3 million per trip. He's also gone 5 times to his golf club in Bedminster, New Jersey. And he's also been once to the Trump Tower in Manhattan. Now, that also adds up to about $60,000 just for golf cart rentals, just for the Secret Service. Now, the fact that the Trumps are expensive is nothing new. We've been talking about it pretty much since Trump came into office. And in fact, we have this this LA Times article, and we are trying to get not interested in this newsletter. There's a cartoon dating back from February, Lifestyle of the Rich and Famous. Speaking of golf carts, you can tip my caddy for me and don't make me look bad by being stingy. It is the taxpayer here, right, that's paying for these trips. Now, adult children, this is the first time in a generation that a president has adult children in the White House, and these adult children are also on the list of security details, and they're also taking trips and business trips on their own. You've got Tiffany Trump, the president's youngest daughter, and her boyfriend vacationing in Germany this summer. That was about $22,000. This July article says, in fact, that so far the family has cost $280,000, and the son Eric has cost about $100,000 just for one business trip to Uruguay. For the travel fees, so $100,000 for the hotel room fees. Now, there's an interesting article in The Atlantic that actually dates from that February trip, and that's just one trip. But actually what Eric Trump was doing while he was in Uruguay was he was visiting a Trump Tower. And that's what this article says is so dangerous. It says, quote, the problem is that the $97,830 charge was for all intents and purposes a business expense, one that will likely be one of many instances. And not only that, it's yet another reminder of the president's refusal to divest from his businesses, a situation that continues to create a multitude of conflicts of interest.
Shana Bhattacharya, thank you so much for that. We'll have to leave it there. Thanks to you for watching France 24. Stay tuned. We'll be back in a few minutes with more headlines with Eve Irvine. Don't go away.